do that kind of work. Now, I'm not going to tell you today exactly what I found out. This is not an academic book. It is written as a kind of investigation of a crime, and there's a narrative drive to this story that if you haven't read it yet, that's so much a part of the experience. So I'm not going to tell you exactly what happened on that farm outside of Prentice on August 1st, 1947. But I want to tell you a little bit about how the book is organized, read a couple of short passages, like I said, probably 3 hours worth, don't worry, and then just open it up for questions. So the book is organized around 3 main characters. Obviously, one of them is my grandfather. You've gotten a chance to look at him here. In this picture, he is serving his 3rd term as sheriff in the early 1970s. Let's see. Here is a picture of him during his 1st term. He's the first man there in that row. The brick building you can see jutting out in the background there is the jail in Jeff Davis County where Versie Johnson would have been held. Of course, if you're Mississippi people, you know that the state had prohibition a long time, and so they're pouring alcohol there. So I'm going to read you a very brief passage about my grandfather, just to get us started kind of diving in to this story. Even as a child, I somehow understood my grandparents as the past. Like many other migrant Southerners, my mom sent me and my siblings back home in the summers. I loved everything about these Mississippi visits with Pa and Monk, as we called my mom's parents. The time I spent with them had a profound influence on the adult that I became. On hot summer afternoons, my grandmother showed me how to crochet, piece quilts, and do needlepoint and a kind of embroidery called crewel. She also taught me to cook. At 5, I could make biscuits, although my grandmother handled the scary part, pulling the hot sheet pan dotted with baked rounds of buttery dough out of the wide white range. Though the house was old, they were careful with their money, and my grandfather always wanted my grandmother to have modern appliances. A white chest freezer full of corn, beans, peas from their garden, and quail that my grandfather had shot shared part of one wall with a regular refrigerator. The first microwave I ever saw, a metal box that looked like something astronauts would use, sat on the Formica counter. And to be honest, they really didn't know how to work it, but there it was. After supper, dinner in Prentice was the meal we called lunch in Atlanta. I would tag along as my grandmother took long walks with her friends. When her minister's wife started an exercise class in the church fellowship hall, I joined that too. Walking back home afterward, we would laugh about the woman who never missed a session but barely moved her arms and legs, too much of a lady to sweat. But the very best thing about my Mississippi visits was my grandfather. Because my grandmother worked half days at the Chancery clerk's office, I spent a lot of time on those trips wandering the countryside with Pa. Most days we stopped at country stores and bought Cokes and candy bars. More than once, we listened to the sing-song twang of auctioneers and bid on cows we never intended to buy. And always as he drove, he talked. His stories transformed the buggy pastures and swampy woods of Jeff Davis County into a dense and magical landscape layered with the traces of people, buildings, and relationships that had come before. Driving the backwoods, he would point out the open window of his GMC truck to a spot where the jonquils bloomed in a line in an empty field and conjure the now-vanished Brady farm or the Mount Carmel settlement with his words. Or he would stop suddenly on the weedy shoulder of a dirt road and say, "I think this is it." Bushwhacking back through tangles of blackberry bushes, he would uncover a choke spring that he remembered from his youth. Miraculously, to this suburban girl at least, we would kneel and drink the clear, cool, delicious water straight from that muddy ground. Besides being a child's best possible companion, the grandfather that I knew, I should say before I wrote this book, was respected by family, friends, and neighbors. His grandparents on both sides had owned farms, but he had grown up hard because his own father was an alcoholic, a serious problem for a person to have in a state that held on to prohibition until 1966. As a boy, he worked so much that he missed a lot of school. And against his family's wishes, he married my grandmother, who came from a desperately poor family and was considered an old maid at age 23. And he loved her fiercely until the day he died. As an adult, he helped his 7 siblings when necessary, especially a sister who never married and a brother who lived with a disability. I was a teenager who could drive, and I actually inherited that GMC truck, so that's what I was driving. And my grandfather was dead by the time Lorraine Lockhart, a black woman who operated a little country store near a piece of property he had owned, moved into her new place. But Miss Lorraine, as I was taught to call her, gave me a tour of her new house and told me that that my grandfather had helped with the paperwork for the federal government program, probably a farmer's home administration loan, that it enabled her to build a brick house with her first indoor plumbing. My grandfather taught me to love history. In the slow, wet heat of those Mississippi summers, I got tangled up in the very past my parents were trying to leave behind. When I was a child, that world often felt more like home to me than the Atlanta suburb where I actually lived. But love is not the same thing as knowledge. It would take decades for me to realize how little I understood about my grandfather and the history that he had helped make. I think I've got one more picture of him. With my grandmother, they're the 23-year-old maid, and as many of you may well know, the logging of the piney woods was really massively underway in the time period when my grandparents married early in the Depression, and so I think it's fitting that they're posed in front of a log truck, of the logging of the longleaf pines. Now, the second major character in this book is Versie Johnson. I don't have a picture of him, but I want to tell you a little bit about what I found out about him. I will say as a preface that I spent a lot of time trying to find his relatives. I came to the conclusion that half of the black people in the Deep South are named Johnson. I'm kidding, I'm sure that's not true, but it is a very common name. His parents had the common names of William and Elizabeth, Bill and Liz. His siblings, for the most part, had pretty widely often used names, and I was never able to locate any of his relatives. Now, to be fair, I may have reached some of them. I sent many, many letters to churches and to just addresses of people that I thought might be descendants. And they may just have decided that they did not want to talk to me, which I think is a valid thing. But I do want to say that I hope someday some of them will step forward and tell that story. Because I didn't find it, I don't have a picture. But I do have what historians always use, historical documents. And I want to tell you a little bit about some of those documents, including this one, which is his draft registration for World War II. Sometimes official documents record the lives of black people, but just as often, those archives also erase them. Of the 41 pieces of evidence I have located that refer to Versie Johnson's life, fewer than 10 directly address what he did before his last days. In almost every case, officials struggled to get his name right, rendering it variously Versie, Virginus, Bercy, and Vernon across 3 census reports, a birth certificate, and a World War II draft registration, and 2 mentions in a small-town newspaper. It's not much to work with, fragments rather than a whole, a man described not so much by how he lived, but by how he died. And yet it is enough to see the outlines of a time when Versie Johnson had a future. Now, unless historians focus on elites, they don't have access to the inner lives of their subjects. A majority of us, of all people that have lived across all times, don't keep diaries. We don't write our thoughts down to keep them for the future. Most families don't even keep family Bibles anymore. A lot of families, my own included, aren't very good at saving letters and other family papers. And, this is one of the problems in doing this kind of research. Some families are lucky, and maybe some of you are these people in your families, the history buff, the person who collects the oral histories, who interviews the family members, records that information, gets down people's stories, makes sure all the pictures are collected and digitized. And that's really just such important work. But most of us don't have that. And one of the things I wanted to convey with this book was that Jim Crow doesn't just affect the lives of people, but it also affects the way that documents are produced, the way that they are saved, the way they are carried into the future. And in that way, Jim Crow segregation really shapes the kind of histories we can tell long after it's over. And so I had to track Versie Johnson through the materials that are left. I was able to go back 3 generations to the enslaver of his great-grandparents in Lawrence County. I was able to find out a fair bit about the generations of his mother's side of his family. I'm not going to tell all of that story now, but I want to sort of bring you into sort of how Versie Johnson gets to Jeff Davis County, because he really spends much of his life in Lawrence and Lincoln counties on either side of that border. And as many of you Mississippi folks will know, and people elsewhere don't, county borders change, and this nearly drove me crazy as a historian. So I don't know for sure whether his family moved or whether their borders changed, because they lived right on the edge of those counties, and sometimes the census would say they lived in one county and sometimes the other. So right there in that border region. But sometime in the 1920s, something happened in Johnson's family. I don't know exactly what it is, so I'm not sure whether the father became ill. It's pretty clear that he dies sometime after 1930. But it also could have been some kind of run-in with the landowners that they were sharecropping for, some kind of an argument about the settlement. Those kinds of things are common. This is a sharecropping family. I should say Versie Johnson's family. There are 7 kids, but something sends them fleeing this area where Versie Johnson's mother, Liz Cooper Johnson, had lived her whole life. And something sends them fleeing. So by 1930, I'm able to trace them to Rankin County. And then after that, it seems that Versie Johnson's father dies, and his older siblings have moved away. And one of those sisters, older sisters, Eula May, has moved to Jeff Davis County. So eventually, Versie Johnson and his mom are going to end up living with Eula May. But I want to read just a little bit about her. One of Versie Johnson's siblings was Eula May. Sometime after her family moved from the place where she had grown up, she settled in Jeff Davis, the next county east of Lawrence. It would prove to be a fateful choice. By 1930, Eula May Johnson worked as a live-in cook for Fred and Nona Dale and their children in one of the grandest houses in Prentiss, right on the main street, Columbia Avenue. Fred Dale, a Navy veteran and a former clerk at the Bank of Blantville, owned and ran a large general store in downtown Prentiss, where his decisions about how much credit to extend to his customers shaped the lives of local Black and white people. Nona, though, was a Berry. Not my grandfather's branch of the family, but the wealthy ones, and the book has already described this, but the founder of the town is one of her relatives. Her father, in fact, is the founder of Prentiss, P.W. Berry, Print Berry, as he's often called. And he was my grandfather's distant cousin. So in this way, and it's a pretty tangential one, my own family tree intersects with Versie Johnson. The fact that his sister is working for my grandfather's cousins. So this is why Versie Johnson ends up in Jeff Davis County. He and his mother and his youngest sister, Gertrude, end up moving there probably after the death of his father and in 1940. And that is where they stay. This causes some problems for Versi Johnson because his sister by then is married to a man named Reggie Knight, who is constantly being arrested for bootlegging and gambling. Now, it's not clear to me whether he's guilty of those things or not, or whether he's just someone who the law is persecuting, but he ends up in the newspapers a lot in those for producing alcohol, selling it, and running illegal card games and dice games, etc. But I want to turn now to this document, which is really one of the most important documents I have for Versi Johnson. So this document is, as I said, his draft registration card. And I'm really drawn to the back of the form, which is this part over here. It's really the closest thing that I have to a portrait of Versi Johnson. But like everything else in the Jim Crow era, it's an image that fuses some of what was actually present with all that white people refused to see. The registrar described Johnson as 5 feet 9 inches, not tall, but not short either. She recorded an in-between weight as well, 175 pounds. She checked the box for black for his hair color and dark brown for his complexion. But it was the eyes that revealed that this description was as much about the white registrar's racism as about the man in front of her. She marked them as black too. The form gave this impossible option. No one actually has black irises. It sets her up. But it seems unlikely that she really tried. To determine Versi Johnson's actual eye color, this white woman would have had to stare into his eyes. She would have had to consider his particular humanity. She would have had to look. I will note as well that he is not signing here, so I don't know if that's because he was not given the option. The census lists him as literate, so I think that maybe the woman must have just signed for him. As you can see, it's the same handwriting that is above it as well. So those are my two main characters, but then there is a third character, and that character is the place, Jeff Davis County, and the story of this rural place in the piney woods. Now, it's a real pleasure to be here in Mississippi where people have some sense of what that is. When I talk in other parts of the country about this book, everyone only knows the Delta, right? If they know anything about Mississippi, they've got a pretty stereotypical, not particularly nuanced vision in their mind, and it's usually the Delta. So I'm not going to explain to you, the sort of entire setting of the piney woods of Mississippi. I think more people here will know about that. But there's 3 aspects of that story that are really important, of that place that are really important to this book. So the first is, I already referred to, the logging. The logging is really key. So before all of these long-leaf pine forests are logged, and the logging goes on there from the 1890s through, but especially it's in the 20th century, and they're really cutting down the last long-leaf pine forests in the late 1930s. Before that, farmers, even sharecroppers, can run their cattle, their pigs in these big open pine forests, even if they don't own them. So they're not technically state or national forests necessarily, although some land is owned by the state government, but no one's really using this land in a way that makes them sort of, surveil it or keep it under their control. And so people take wood and they let their pigs go, and they have this kind of access to a space where they can get extra resources that don't have to come from their own land. And this, I think, is really, really an important part of the story, because as Versi Johnson and my grandfather are growing up, this forest is becoming a ruin. So it's just, slash and burn. It's just being clear-cut everywhere. They've brought in those big steam engine loaders, skidders, that are dragging the trunks to hastily built railroad cars and just absolutely destroying the land. And so that is the backdrop to this story. But even more important, the piney woods, and especially Jeff Davis County, is a place of black flourishing in Jim Crow America. Let me just tell you, my New York editors, I had to beat them over the head to get them to understand that you can both understand that Jim Crow is oppressive, and also at the same time that in some places Black people are able to flourish. Those things can both happen in a similar space. They really didn't believe me. They wanted to sort of understand this history as only violence. But I think if you don't understand how much this community was flourishing, you don't understand what was lost, what was being attacked when Versie Johnson was killed, and what was lost in the aftermath. This is his birth certificate. I won't leave that up there. I don't think you guys need this as much, but just look at that boundary sort of around close to Fair River. That's where Versie Johnson grew up there between Lincoln and Lawrence County. Let's see what's next. I guess we can just leave up no, let's get through here. This is Prentiss early on. Another picture of Prentiss, the county seat of Jeff Davis County. And I want to leave this picture up. I'll come to it in just a minute. So what happens in the aftermath of emancipation in the Piney Woods region of Mississippi is that Black people are fleeing from the Delta. So they're moving out of the Delta, if they have the means, into other places where they might have more of a chance to buy their own land, where they might have a chance to live more separated from white people, to escape places where maybe they've been enslaved. The race relations of the Delta are understood in that time period by Black people as worse than they are elsewhere. And so you see people moving into this region. Jeff Davis County is not a county yet, but moving into this region and creating what scholars call free towns. I think town may be too big of a word for these places, but settlements of emancipated people who are coming together, pooling their resources, trying to buy land, creating their own schools, trying to create meaningful freedom. And the land that becomes Jeff Davis County attracts a lot of these folks because the land is relatively inexpensive. And as the timber companies cut down the forest, that land is even cheaper. And so people are able to buy that and add to their holdings. And Black farmers have holdings as large as 1,000 acres by World War II in this period. During the height of the Depression, there were over 300 Black-owned farms in Jeff Davis County, which is a third of all farming households in this county Black farming households own their own land, which is a really high percentage for this time and place. And many people that sharecrop, Black sharecroppers are sharecropping for Black owners. Because this community is, again, within the limits of Jim Crow segregation, pretty prosperous, very early on they found their own school, the Prentiss Institute. And these pictures are from the Prentiss Institute. This is a graduating class in the early 1920s. This is the Rosenwald building that the Prentiss Institute was able to construct with help from the community and the Rosenwald Fund. And this little building on the top is what they call the 1907 house. Has anyone been to the Prentiss Institute? I realize I'm in a place where, yeah, so people have been. So the 1907 house was the original school. The whole school was there. That house was originally built as the house of a plantation owner. There were some plantations in this area, just nothing like in the Delta. But some of the Black farmers pooled their resources, loaned money and underwrote a loan for the Johnsons, a couple that moved into the county to found the Prentiss Institute. And it was one of those wonderful institutions that originally educated everybody from toddlers to grandparents, and then over time developed an elementary school, a high school, a junior college, a normal school for teacher training. For a while they ran a seminary. Then they started offering VOTAC classes for veterans that could use their GI benefits. And then in the end, they became a junior college. And so it was one of those institutions that was sort of there for whatever the community needed. But it's probably obvious, but I think it's worth pointing out, this is not a place where most people have a college degree. So Black farm families in this area have access to more education locally and often are more educated than many white people that are here. So this story of Black flourishing, churches, farms, separate communities, their own educational institutions, Again, in Mississippi, you might know that story, but I think it's a story that a lot of Americans, white and black, don't know. And that, I think, is really crucial because the third part of this book is the history of racial violence, of white violence against black people. And it's important to know what it is that white people are attacking. And in part, that is black flourishing. So this third part of the story is, as I said, the history of white racial violence and a concept I call the hands of the law. This is really just the last thing that I want to talk about. And that is a very old way of thinking of the law, not as an abstraction, not as a set of institutions or even laws written on paper or sort of standardized practices, but the law as something that you hold in your hands, as a kind of physical power. And there is a long history of white men in places like Mississippi, not just Mississippi for sure, having this kind of vision of what the law is. It really starts with wars against Native American peoples. In this region, it's mostly Choctaws, Jeff Davis County area, but of course other tribes as well. But it also has its roots in slave patrols, where all white men in a community are deputized informally to patrol to police, to surveil the activities of enslaved people, especially at night. And this way of thinking about the law, I think it's important to realize, does not just produce vigilante violence, although it does. If you think you're the hands of the law, then you think whatever you do is the law. And so Mississippi newspapers will say things like, the people formed their own jury, they formed their own law group, and they went out and they produced justice. The white newspapers will talk about it almost as a kind of community policing when people are doing vigilante or, killing people in acts of vigilante violence. But I think it's important to recognize that this idea of being the hands of the law, as personally having that power of the law in your hands, also produces a lot of misbehavior on the part of law enforcement officers. Now, I don't say this to say that all law enforcement officers act in a way that violates the law understood as abstraction, as a set of rules and practices that are supposed to guarantee neutrality. But that law officers, some, understand the law as their own personal power, so whatever they do is the law, and so they cannot conceive of themselves as breaking it. And I just want to read a very short passage for the end and then really open it up to questions. Because I think that this way of thinking about the law is really still present in America and is a source of some of our contemporary problems. So beneath this local lie, the cover-up of what actually happened to Versie Johnson, lay the bigger lies that serve as the foundation of post-Reconstruction American life, that segregation and discriminatory voting requirements did not violate the Constitution. Lying was how the system worked, and most people knew that. For a time, the civil rights movement forced those lies into the open and broke them apart. And yet today, the radical promise of the Supreme Court's Brown decision remains only partially implemented. The Voting Rights Act lies in tatters. Few white people are even willing to talk about this, much less support the material reparations that might begin to address the harm caused by both slavery and Jim Crow segregation. And violence continues to deprive black people of their futures. In the last decade, and there's so many names, I can't include them all, but people like Michael Brown, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, like Versie Johnson, have all been killed by law enforcement officials. Others, like Ahmaud Arbery, have been killed by vigilantes. And while the particulars are important, both to the families of the people killed and to the process of trying to hold the perpetrators legally accountable, the details can obscure an important commonality. In all these cases, the killers, whether law enforcement officials or not, believed that they were actually acting as the hands of the law. But the law enforcement officers do not have unlimited legal authority to act. They too can be guilty of breaking the law, even when in their own minds they are enforcing it. In that sense, they too can become vigilantes. they can become lynchers. Across American history, efforts to end this kind of vigilante violence, like the anti-lynching movement, have often had the unintended consequence of driving these acts underground. That can mean that perpetrators cover up what they do, but it can also mean that people who want to be the hands of the law, who want to feel like they personally hold the law's power in their hands, have an incentive to go into law enforcement work where they can act with greater impunity. Today, the lying continues. Rather than trying to stop vigilante behavior, many states encourage it. Stand your ground and open carry laws tempt citizens to act like law enforcement officers. More recently, in some states, anti-abortion laws offer to pay rewards to citizens who police other citizens' reproductive health choices. Vigilantes are being transformed into heroes. But what many anti-lynching activists understood in the past remains true today. Citizenship is meaningless if a person's body is not safe. Protection from violence is the essential foundation of our democratic life. And this ultimately is what my grandfather set out to kill that day in 1947. Thank you. I could talk more, but it is right at the time. The book really does go into the 50s and 60s and up to the present in the history of Jeff Davis County. And it's an interesting way to look at what white people have been willing to destroy so as not to have to share it with their white neighbors. The swimming pools filled in, the wonderful school systems dismantled, the voting rights that are violated, and we could go on. And I really try to detail that in the last part of the book. I just want to quickly show you a couple of pictures. This is the dormitory at the Prentice Institute today, and this is a picture that I made of what I call the archive. So the fact that the archive is not preserved, as you can see, there are some materials at the Mississippi Department of Archives, but much of it lays moldering in the buildings of the Prentice Institute, which truly makes me cry. I am a nerdy historian, after all, every time I see this. Here is, if you noticed in an earlier picture of Prentice, the very first shot that I had from early in its history, a picture of the Palace Drugs. Well, the Palace Drugs is one of the only businesses still in Prentice, one of the continuities across its whole history. The county is founded in 1906, the town in 1903. There it is still functioning, but as you can see, downtown is pretty bleak, like much of rural America, not just in the Deep South. Jeff Davis County is very much suffering. It's a place that most people leave if they can, with the exception of people who have family land there and have retired there and have some kind of support for retirement coming in from elsewhere. It's a place that many people are leaving because there's no work, there's no employment. The economy is really, really bad there. So I'll just leave that up. Right there, 1245. Okay, that's what Chris told me to do. So I hope you have questions. I'm sure somebody will. And please ask.
Raise your hand, yeah, we'll bring
Yeah.
the microphone to you.
Oh, yes, I forgot. Chris will bring you the microphone. I was supposed to say that. Chris will bring you the microphone.
I hope you don't think I'm asking you to give away the narrative, but I am very interested in why in 1941 Mr. Johnson was living 30 miles away in Delo and actually working for a man, 20 miles from Delo in Pinola. Do we know what he was doing for Mr. White and why it was he was located in Delo to do it?
It's a great question. So, like the intrepid researcher I set off to Simpson County to dig into the circuit court records. I called, I didn't like the answer they gave me on the phone, so I went in person. They don't have any of the records from that time period. So he had a couple of run-ins with the law that made it into the Simpson County newspaper, Versi Johnson did. I can't find out what they are. The newspaper doesn't say, and the records are no longer in existence. This is a real problem in America, and it's, again, not just a Mississippi problem. Especially rural courthouses really have a hard time preserving their records. They don't even really have enough money to maintain their buildings in a lot of parts of America, again, not just Mississippi. And so, records from the past really aren't their number one priority. So I was not able to find out exactly what he was doing. Since his brother-in-law was a bootlegger, I think it's likely that one of the things he was doing was working as a kind of branch of his brother-in-law's business, or maybe his white employer was a bootlegger and he was working for him. I think if he had done something that was really bad, the newspaper would have said what he did, as opposed to just mentioning that he was arrested. So I think it must be pretty low level, whatever he was arrested for a couple of times in Simpson County, but I don't know exactly what he was doing. I imagine he's living in Delo because the mill is shut down by then, and the housing, some of the mill housing is left behind, and it must be really, really cheap. But it is odd that he's working for somebody that lives so far away. And again, I'm wondering if there's not some kind of business, off-the-books business going on, but I don't know for sure. I'm sorry, I can't answer it. Again, the limits of the archive are really a problem.
I had a question. Was Versi Johnson related to Jonas Johnson, the founder?
No, he was not. So, and also one of the most important black farming families in Jeff Davis County is also Johnson, but is not the Johnsons that founded Prentice Institute. So this gets very confusing, but they're not related families.
I would like to make a statement. I had another question about the law enforcement, but another statement is Prentice Institute was a great institution for those who don't know, and they uplifted the lives of a lot of black people.
Let's
from
put that back
Prentice
up
area
there.
on over to the Jones County area.
Yeah, the people that really helped me to start having conversations in the county were the alums from the Prentice Institute. So they have a quite strong alum group. Some of the people that were active in it when I started this research have now died, unfortunately, but they really single-handedly have raised money. They got the 1907 house put on the historic register. They got the whole campus put on the register. They raised the money to redo the Waldorf school. They're a very dedicated bunch, and they, of course, by the time I'm talking to them, they're mostly people who went to the junior college in the 60s and 70s, right? Just because other people are not still there. But they really found their lives profoundly changed by this institution. And I think that really is the history of the Prentice Institute across its history from 1907 when it's founded to the late 1980s. I think it's 88, excuse me, when it shuts down. It was really an institution that changed lives. So thank you for bringing that up. Excuse me, that's something that I talk about in the book, and I think it's really one of the things that makes the community there as rich and strong as it is. It's also, frankly, where the NAACP chapter is really grounded in Jeff Davis County. So that right after Versi Johnson's killing, local people start their first NAACP chapter in Jeff Davis County. It took me forever to find it because they didn't, of course, want to name it the Jeff Davis chapter. Of course they didn't, right? I mean, and in fact, the evidence suggests, I can't really prove this, but the evidence suggests that Vardaman's governor when the county is made, and that it's named Jeff Davis as a kind of early example of trolling, because it's always a black majority and they're just poking at people, right? So we're going to create a black majority county and name it Jeff Davis. So they named it Prentice chapter, but this creates, a kind of problem when you're trying to look things up, because the NAACP archivist will tell you that all the chapters are named for counties. Excuse me, sorry, I'm having spring allergies. Apologies for that. So,
water under the...
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. Chris has thought of everything.
No, not at all. All right, we have a question from the live stream. Martha Hutchinson says, during that era, all blacks attended J.E. Johnson School, grades 1 through 12. Would they have had a yearbook with his photo?
So Versi Johnson was the last part of that with, would he be in the
Yeah,
in the
I think
annual?
that was it.
Versi Johnson didn't go to school in Jeff Davis County. He didn't move to Jeff Davis County until he was already grown up. He was an adult by the time he moved there and out of school. He would have finished school in Rankin County, depending on how long he was in school, and people attended for various amounts of time. So, sorry, there's somebody behind you, but there's someone up front next after this question.
You may have not have discovered this in your research, but you mentioned Reggie Knight was a bootlegger.
Yeah.
Did you ever figure out if he was of any relation to Newt Knight, the Jones County Free Stater?
I'm sorry.
Newt Knight, Jones County Free Stater, was he of any relation to Newt Knight?
I don't think that he was related to Knight, but I can't say that for sure. I mean, one of the things that is complicated about genealogies is the interweaving of white and black families and families having the same last names because of past relationships during the time before emancipation. So I don't think he is related, but I will say that with 75% certainty. So.
Forgive me, I'm somewhat confused. I'm trying to find, what is the lie in this book? You say that there's a lie? The book title.
Oh, The Lie. Yes, The Lie is the story of what was printed in the newspaper and the family story that I grew up with about what happened, because neither of those stories are true. So The Lie is the way that both my family and the white community covered up what actually happened to Versi Johnson. So that's The Lie. And I'm not sort of explaining exactly what I found out, just because I'm hoping that you might read the book. It's available at libraries as well as, of course, for purchase. So. Oh, sorry. Can you get this person in the front next? Sorry, she's been very patient. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Forgive me if I don't stand. I don't stand as well as I used to.
No problem.
But I want to ask whether your interest, which is clearly more than mere history, also allows you to say anything about two, maybe three unrelated items on which you did not touch, but about some of which you must know. Number one, Duck Hill.
Yeah.
Number two, Isaiah Montgomery. I'm about to forget the others.
Go
But
ahead.
I ask this since I myself wandered into lots of things, and I used to be a member of the faculty on which you now have the honor to stand.
Well, thank you for coming. It's really nice to see another University of Virginia professor here, and a rare treat, not expected in Jackson. So great to have you here. So there is a huge section of the book about Duck Hill. Duck Hill, for those of you who don't know, it shouldn't be a competition, but it might be the most notorious lynching. I mean, I think today people sort of always talk about Emmett Till, and why we need to have the most well-known lynching. It's not something that really should exist as a contest. But in the time period, I think that Duck Hill is really the most notorious and infamous lynching. It happens in 1937 in Duck Hill, Mississippi, outside of Duck Hill, Mississippi. And it is important because there's really sort of horrific acts of torture that the lynchers capture with their cameras, and I'm not going to go into that. But it's also important because it's a turning point in the anti-lynching movement. So the NAACP is really, in many ways, founded on the subject of lynching as an anti-lynching organization. It's one of the things they've been doing since their founding. By the 1930s, they've really become a pretty strong, really an incredibly strong organization. And I will say historians love them because they so knew that what they were doing was for the ages that they kept great papers. So thank you all secretaries for the NAACP. But the Duck Hill lynching happens in 1937 as Congress is debating an anti-lynching bill. So from the 1920s on, there's an anti-lynching bill, or sometimes as many as 100 anti-lynching bills introduced in every Congress, in the House and the Senate every year. And a lot of that is the work of the NAACP. They've succeeded in politicizing this issue, and there are bills introduced every year. One of them is being debated in Congress when this lynching happens in Duck Hill. And somebody thinks to telegraph congressional aides, who then bring that information to the floor of the House really just after this lynching has happened. And the House then passes this anti-lynching bill, and it almost passes the Senate, but it's held up by a filibuster. So these things really do keep coming around in our history. As an aside, I will say that that lynching bill, of course, was finally passed in 2020, now named after Emmett Till, but that is the anti-lynching bill that was passed. So Duck Hill becomes infamous because of the torture, because of the pictures, because white newspapers and Time magazine published the pictures. So black newspapers have been publishing lynching photographs before this, but traditionally white publications haven't published them. So these publications, I think it's the Memphis paper and Time, maybe also Life, anyway, publish these photographs. They get hold of these photographs. And it just becomes the sort of sensation of the moment, right? That this barbarity is captured in photographs, that it really brings home the message of the anti-lynching movement. What happens as a result of that is that it's really a high point of anti-lynching activism. Sorry, I'm a college professor. I'm going on too long. Sorry, let me try to be short. It politicizes, it takes the anti-lynching movement, it becomes so politicized that it makes white people in the South start lying about lynchings in a way that they haven't before and covering them up. And there's a huge amount of research, some of it by the NAACP and by others, that show that lynching is, quote unquote, moving underground in the wake of Duck Hill. So that the next, you don't want to be the next Duck Hill. You don't want to be the place that's notorious for having this horrific lynching in your community. And what that means in a lot of places is that law enforcement is handling things that lynch mobs would have handled before. I'm going to stop there. Do you want to say something about Isaiah Montgomery? Because you brought that up, him up. So quickly, I think we're running out of time, and I'm sorry I gave too long of an answer, but
about Isaiah Montgomery.
yeah.
Isaiah Montgomery was the sole black member of the 1890 Constitutional Convention, and there had to be a special order, which I have never understood, to create Jefferson Davis County as a place for a seat in that convention. And I thought you might know something about that.
The county wasn't founded till 1906, so it wouldn't have been the 1890 Congress.
See the 1890 document.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you may have touched on what I was going to mention. I enjoy rambling through the archives here, and was looking through papers one day when I came up on papers about a congressional hearing, and this may have been on the lynching law in 1937 that they were discussing. But there was a purge in those counties, Lincoln, Copiah, Simpson, that the congressional hearings were investigating. So there were witnesses coming in talking about how they had been terrorized as this purge. And Versie Johnson going to Rankin County may have been the result of that purge.
Do you know when that happened? I don't know about this. This is fascinating.
I'm thinking that it might have been in the 1920s, but I
Okay.
don't remember exactly.
That's, the timing would be really, would
Yes.
line up there.
But
And
I-
do you know what was the cause of this particular purge?
They were trying.
We're really getting nerdy here, sorry,
They-
this is fascinating.
The purge was to remove as many blacks, landowners, and sharecroppers from those counties as possible.
Okay, that's
And it only
fascinating.
concentrated on that Lincoln, Copiah
Okay.
area. So that may have been what he was caught in.
Yeah,
And
all right,
so
I'm going to
he went
find you
to-
after and get more details on that. That's really, thank you for that. I was not able to uncover that.
We have copies of the book over here, again, a handful of them, but they tell me that they can take an order and send you a copy of the book if you don't get one today. Lots of stuff going on. Pick up schedules and programs over there to keep up with it all. Don't forget that there's cake outside. We've got Cecile Wardlow here. If anybody is interested in signing up for the Greenwood Cemetery tours, you can talk to her. That's right, a Black History tour of Greenwood Cemetery. And come buy a book. Help me thank
Thank you,
Grace Elizabeth Hale
Thank
for this
you.
fantastic program today.
thank you.